On September 20, 1946, Henry Wallace sat in his Commerce Department office, staring at the phone. Harry Truman had just fired him. The president's voice had been polite but firm, and the decision was final. Wallace had served as Vice President of the United States from 1941 to 1945. He had sat across from Franklin Roosevelt in cabinet meetings while they planned the war effort. He had traveled the world as FDR's personal representative and had been one heartbeat away from the presidency for 4 years. Now, he was unemployed, dismissed by a man he considered an accident of history, someone who should never have become president in the first place. Wallace picked up the phone and called his closest advisors. He told them he would accept a position as editor of the New Republic. From that platform, he intended to attack Truman's policies relentlessly. He wanted to show the American people that Truman had stolen Roosevelt's legacy and was steering the country toward another world war. His advisors warned him it would be political suicide. Wallace didn't care about his political career anymore. He cared about stopping what he saw as Truman's disastrous foreign policy. He believed Truman was betraying everything Roosevelt had fought for. What followed was one of the most determined campaigns to undermine a sitting president from within his own party. Wallace traveled to every major city to deliver speeches attacking Truman's policies and wrote articles accusing him of warmongering. By 1948, he would run as a third-party candidate, coming closer to success than many realized. Wallace firmly believed he was the rightful heir to Roosevelt's presidency, a conviction rooted not in paranoia but in 4 years of undeniable experience. Roosevelt had chosen Wallace as his running mate in 1940, despite strong objections from party bosses. The Democratic establishment considered him too liberal, too idealistic, and too supportive of labor unions and civil rights. Roosevelt insisted, declaring to the Democratic Convention that he wanted Wallace or he would not run for a third term. Wallace became one of the most active vice presidents in American history. Roosevelt sent him on diplomatic missions to Latin America, China, and the Soviet Union. He chaired the Board of Economic Warfare and gave speeches outlining Roosevelt's vision for the post-war world, becoming the public face of FDR's domestic and foreign policy. By 1944, Wallace believed he was Roosevelt's chosen successor. He had earned it through loyal service. But the 1944 Democratic Convention shattered his hopes. Party bosses hated him, viewing him as a dreamer detached from political reality. They feared his liberal positions on labor and civil rights would cost the Democrats votes and worried about the consequences if Wallace became president. In July 1944, party leaders confronted Roosevelt at the White House, insisting Wallace had to go. Roosevelt, visibly ill, acquiesced but left the replacement decision open. The bosses bypassed chaos and handpicked a safe, uncontroversial senator from Missouri, Harry Truman. Wallace fought back, leveraging his delegates and supporters to force a first ballot vote. But Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly cited a fire hazard due to overcrowding, adjourning the convention just as pro-Wallace chants reached their peak. By the next day, the bosses had consolidated support for Truman on the second ballot. Wallace was out. Roosevelt tried to soften the blow, writing Wallace that he would personally vote for him if he were a delegate. At the same time, he assured party leaders he would be content with Truman or William Douglas. FDR had played both sides, a betrayal for Wallace, who had been Roosevelt's loyal soldier for 4 years. The dying president offered polite words while simultaneously signing Wallace's political death warrant. Now, Wallace was sidelined because party bosses found him inconvenient. The man who replaced him was scarcely known to Roosevelt. When Roosevelt won re-election in November 1944, he offered Wallace the position of Secretary of Commerce, a consolation prize and a clear demotion. Wallace accepted, still believing he could influence policy and that Roosevelt would value his contributions. Then Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. Truman became president, and Wallace found himself serving under the man who had replaced him. The irony was bitter. Truman, in Wallace's eyes, was unqualified, a small man filling a giant's shoes. Wallace had spent years at Roosevelt's side shaping global policy, while Truman was a former haberdasher from Missouri, a failed hat shop owner, and a product of the corrupt Pendergast political machine. Wallace had been Roosevelt's trusted advisor for 4 years. Truman had met him only twice during his 3 months as vice president. Yet now, Truman was president, and Wallace was Secretary of Commerce. The resentment was not just political, it was visceral. Truman initially kept Wallace in the cabinet as a gesture toward party unity. Roosevelt's supporters needed reassurance that Truman would continue FDR's policies, and keeping Wallace as Commerce Secretary sent that signal. Cabinet meetings, however, were excruciating. Wallace watched the man who should have been his subordinate struggle under the weight of the presidency. Each time Truman made a decision, Wallace measured it against what Roosevelt would have done. It quickly became clear that Truman did not share Roosevelt's vision, particularly regarding the Soviet Union, and Wallace realized he could not remain silent. The fundamental disagreement between Wallace and Truman centered on Joseph Stalin. Wallace believed Stalin could be trusted if America showed good faith, while Truman saw Stalin as a dictator intent on expanding Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Wallace's perspective came from his 1944 trip to the Soviet Union, where he toured Magadan and the Kola gold mines in Siberia. Although these sites were part of the Gulag system, NKVD handlers presented them as volunteer labor camps with well-fed workers, and Wallace famously described the camp director as a sensitive man. He left convinced that cooperation with Stalin was possible. Truman, however, had witnessed Stalin break every agreement made at Yalta, and while Wallace saw a partner, Truman saw a predator. From rigged elections in Poland to the looting of East Germany, Stalin was systematically undermining the promises of Yalta. By early 1946, Truman had adopted a policy of firmness toward Soviet expansion. George Kennan's long telegram emphasized that Stalin respected only strength, and the policy that would become known as containment began to take shape. America would resist Soviet expansion while avoiding direct military confrontation. Wallace viewed this approach as dangerously wrong. Having seen the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he feared atomic war and argued that Truman's tough stance could provoke Stalin into aggression. Wallace believed that if America showed trust and cooperation, Stalin would reciprocate. Wallace presented these arguments privately in cabinet meetings, wrote memos, and requested one-on-one meetings with Truman, but the president either listened politely or was too busy to engage. By September 1946, Wallace grew desperate. Truman's approach seemed likely to push the world toward confrontation with the Soviets. Believing another war was imminent unless someone intervened, Wallace decided to go public. On September 12, 1946, Wallace addressed 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden in New York City, speaking on foreign policy. He claimed to have cleared the speech with Truman's staff. Yet his message directly contradicted the administration's official stance in Europe. While James Burns negotiated from a position of strength in Paris, Wallace told the crowd that America needed trust and cooperation. He argued that Truman's firmness risked war, that atomic weapons were making the Soviets paranoid, and that their occupation of Eastern Europe was defensive, not aggressive. He claimed that Stalin would allow free elections if the U.S. stopped confronting him. The crowd, mostly liberals hoping Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation remained possible, embraced his message. The press reacted immediately. Reporters noted that Wallace, while a cabinet member, had publicly contradicted American foreign policy. Foreign policy experts warned that Moscow would see Wallace's speech as a sign of American division and weakness. James Burns, furious, cabled Truman demanding clarification. If Wallace spoke for the administration, Burns would resign. If not, Wallace had to be silenced. Truman, caught politically, claimed he had approved the speech without fully reading it. Wallace's staff had submitted it, and Truman waved it through. Truman spent a week managing the fallout, issuing a statement that Wallace's speech reflected his personal opinion, not administration policy. This satisfied no one. How could a cabinet member hold a personal view directly opposing the president's foreign policy? Wallace refused to retreat, giving interviews defending his stance and insisting that the American people deserved debate. He implied Truman's advisers were warmongering and suggested Roosevelt would have agreed with him. This confrontation was the breaking point. Wallace was inexperienced in high-level policy and invoked Roosevelt's legacy to undermine Truman, implying a betrayal. On September 20, 1946, Truman summoned Wallace to the White House. He demanded a cabinet united on foreign policy and gave Wallace the choice: cease public dissent or resign. Wallace resisted, citing his constitutional right to free speech and asserting that the public needed alternative views on foreign policy. Truman ended the meeting and dictated a letter accepting Wallace's resignation, which was delivered that afternoon. Wallace, stunned, had expected Truman to back down, believing his political base and support from Roosevelt liberals gave him leverage. He had miscalculated. Truman was prepared to lose Wallace's supporters rather than tolerate a cabinet member publicly contradicting policy. Party unity mattered less than coherence in administration policy. Alone in his office, Wallace realized he was now free from cabinet discipline and administrative loyalty. Free to speak his mind, he immediately called a press conference, announcing his dedication to reshaping American foreign policy. He accused Truman of pushing the nation toward permanent confrontation with the Soviet Union. Analysts warned Wallace had jeopardized his political career, but he remained undeterred, convinced that stopping Truman's policy was more important than personal ambition. From October 1946 through 1948, Wallace delivered hundreds of speeches across America, appealing to war-weary citizens with the message that conflict with Stalin was a choice, not inevitability. The media coverage amplified his reach, making him the most prominent critic of containment. Truman's advisers worried, as Wallace's message resonated with many Democrats. While Wallace lacked the strength to win elections, he could still split the party. Over time, Wallace's rhetoric grew more extreme. By early 1947, he argued that Truman's policies were provoking Soviet aggression. He claimed that disarmament and displays of good faith would earn reciprocal cooperation from Stalin. He suggested that Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe resulted from U.S. confrontational behavior. Experts rejected this, noting Stalin had violated agreements prior to Truman's tough stance. Wallace was, in effect, blaming the victim. Supporters ignored expert analysis, focusing instead on avoiding war. Wallace became the sole prominent politician promoting the idea that conflict with Stalin was preventable. Intelligence agencies soon noticed that Soviet propaganda frequently quoted him, with Radio Moscow broadcasting his speeches and newspapers reprinting his articles. While Wallace saw this as validation of his truthfulness, the U.S. intelligence community recognized a troubling pattern. His speaking tours were organized by groups with Soviet ties, and his staff included individuals with connections to Communist Front organizations. Though sincere, Wallace was being exploited by Moscow. In March 1947, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, seeking aid for Greece and Turkey against communist insurgencies. Wallace responded immediately, condemning the doctrine as a declaration of war on the Soviet Union, an attempt to establish an American empire, and a betrayal of Roosevelt's vision for the United Nations and collective security. While his criticism energized his base, it alarmed mainstream Democrats and even skeptical liberals who believed aid to Greece and Turkey was strategic defense rather than warmongering. Wallace refused to moderate his message, and in June 1947, he denounced the European Recovery Program, labeling it economic imperialism intended to encircle the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan was immensely popular with both the American public and European governments. Wallace's opposition, however, made him appear increasingly isolated and extreme. Still, he pressed on, convinced he was preventing a catastrophic conflict between the superpowers. In December 1947, Henry Wallace announced his candidacy for president, declaring that he would lead a new progressive party committed to peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union. The announcement shocked the political establishment. Wallace knew he had little chance of winning. Third-party candidates historically never succeeded in presidential elections. Yet he believed he could pressure Truman to alter his foreign policy. By drawing enough votes away from Truman, Wallace thought the president would have to moderate his stance toward the Soviets to secure re-election. The Progressive Party platform called for immediate negotiations with Stalin, the withdrawal of American troops from Europe, the sharing of atomic weapons technology with the United Nations, including the Soviet Union, the dismantling of American military bases abroad, and the end of economic aid tied to anti-communist conditions. Essentially, it reflected Moscow's desires. Soviet media celebrated Wallace's candidacy, and communist parties across Europe endorsed him. Wallace accepted their support, arguing that anyone committed to peace should be welcome in his coalition. Politically, this proved disastrous. Wallace's ties to communists allowed Truman to depict him as a Soviet dupe, and liberal Democrats who might have supported his message refused to join a campaign so closely associated with communism. In early 1948, Wallace campaigned across the United States. His rallies drew thousands, and his message of peace resonated with voters weary of international tension. Polls indicated he was attracting 10 to 15% of the vote, almost entirely from Democrats who would otherwise support Truman. Democratic leaders panicked. If Wallace pulled that many votes, Truman risked losing to Republican Thomas Dewey, potentially flipping the White House to Republican control and dismantling all that Roosevelt had built. Truman's advisers urged him to moderate his foreign policy to regain Wallace supporters, but he refused. He would not compromise American strategic policy for political expediency. The The Soviets were expanding, and containment was essential. Wallace's supporters would have to choose between idealism and reality. By summer 1948, predictions of Truman's defeat were widespread. The Democratic Party was fracturing. Wallace drew liberal votes, Southern Democrats had split off over civil rights to form the Dixiecrat Party, and Thomas Dewey was running a strong Republican campaign. Every poll showed Truman losing. Newsweek surveyed 50 top political writers. All 50 predicted a Dewey victory. The Chicago Daily Tribune even prepared a victory headline for Dewey before the votes were counted. Truman's presidency seemed finished. Wallace didn't need to win. He only needed to make Truman lose. By siphoning liberal votes in key states like New York, Michigan, and Maryland, he appeared poised to hand the election to the Republicans. But the final months of the campaign changed everything. Events in Europe vindicated Truman's policy and exposed Wallace's naivety. In February 1948, Communists staged a coup in Czechoslovakia, overthrowing the democratic government. In June, the Soviet Union blocked all ground access to West Berlin, forcing the Berlin airlift. These developments proved Truman's warnings accurate. Stalin had no interest in cooperation or free elections, and Soviet expansion was real and aggressive. Wallace's arguments about Stalin's defensive intentions now seemed absurd. American voters shifted their support, and Wallace's poll numbers dropped from 10 to 15% to just 5%. Liberals who had been tempted by his peace message now concluded that containment was necessary, and war-weary Americans realized that cooperation with Stalin was impossible. On Election Day, Wallace received only 2.4% of the national vote and no electoral votes. His campaign ultimately demonstrated the flaws in his judgment about Soviet intentions. Truman went on to win re-election in one of the greatest upsets in American political history. Wallace's two-year campaign to undermine Truman had failed spectacularly and had discredited the very positions he had advocated. His association with Soviet propaganda made opposition to containment politically toxic. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea with Soviet weapons and Stalin's approval. The unprovoked attack confirmed everything Truman had argued about Soviet intentions. Had the U.S. followed Wallace's advice, retreating from Asia, sharing atomic technology with the UN, or dismantling the military, South Korea would have fallen swiftly, the Soviets would have acquired nuclear weapons sooner, and the entire Korean peninsula might have fallen under communist control. The Korean War destroyed whatever credibility Wallace had left. Stalin had demonstrated that military force, not cooperation, drove Soviet expansion. Containment was the only effective policy. Wallace quietly supported Truman's decision to defend South Korea, signaling a tacit admission that he had been wrong about everything. By 1952, Wallace had retreated from public life. He wrote occasional articles but never again challenged American foreign policy. In that period, he had spent 2 years attempting to destroy Truman's presidency, only to destroy his own legacy in the process. In 1952, Wallace published an article in This Week magazine titled "Where I Was Wrong." It was his closest approach to a full apology. He admitted he had been naive about Soviet intentions and acknowledged that some organizations supporting his 1948 campaign were influenced by communists. He conceded that containment was necessary, but he never admitted the fundamental error. He had been so convinced Truman was wrong that he spent 2 years opposing a president who was actually correct. He had delivered speeches that Soviet propaganda exploited to undermine American policy and ran a campaign that almost jeopardized Truman's re-election at a critical Cold War moment. Wallace died in 1965, largely forgotten in American politics. Former supporters quietly distanced themselves, and liberal intellectuals who once cheered him admitted they had been wrong. His name became synonymous with naive appeasement. Obituaries highlighted his service as vice president and agricultural achievements but largely overlooked his 2-year campaign against Truman. Henry Wallace had spent years attempting to undermine Truman because he misjudged the Soviet Union. History proved Wallace wrong. His tragedy lay not in a lack of patriotism but in an excess of hope. He saw a partner in Stalin because the alternative, a terrifying global conflict, was too frightening to accept. In the end, conviction could not replace judgment, and being Roosevelt's vice president did not make someone qualified to be Roosevelt's successor.